Good afternoon, and welcome to Volume 6 of Christ-Centered Reflections from White Rock Baptist Church. I'm Reverend Steve Lawrence, and joining me today are our ministerial staff. Here's Reverend Wayman Rucker, Reverend J. Gardner, Reverend Donna Jones, and Reverend Kenneth Cox. These segments are a part of a series of reflections that we hope will be helpful to you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Today, our focus is on the place where we are and a passage in Romans where Paul deals with calling. So let me start with the room that we're in. This room, as in many Baptist churches, has multifunction and goes by many names. Currently, it's called the WMU room, Women's Mission Union, because it's used for a lot of the meetings of the WMU circles. But in an earlier life and in a current life, it serves as a Sunday school classroom. Most recently, it's been the classroom for the Genesis class. But before that manifestation, it was the middle high department for 14 and 15-year-old students. Now, this room has a lot of special significance for me because it's a place where I met my mentor, Deacon Leroy Bain. And he was the person who got me thinking about vocation. And my first vocation that I was thinking about wasn't ministry, but it was in classes here that he pushed on me to think about what my future might be. And when I look back on that, it's amazing to see the line of connection that I never saw from there. It got me thinking about how every time we reflect on what it is that we do, we reflect on our calling, we get a different picture of it because we see the past differently.
Yes, we do.
So there are a lot of call narratives in the scripture. We've got Paul on the Damascus Road and Abraham and Samuel. There are all these models that we use for calling for ourselves. But I was really intrigued by something that I saw in the book of Romans, right at the first chapter, the first verse. Romans is a book that Paul is writing to a church that he's never visited. So they don't know who he is except what they've heard about him. And probably a lot of that is negative. After all, he used to be the number one enemy of the fellowship. But he writes to them and he has to express who he is. So in that first verse, I hear him sort of rediscovering or reinterpreting his calling, what God has called him to do. And in that calling, he says four things. Two of them, I think, are God, or what God has done for him. And then two of them are his response to that. So I want to talk about those, the two things that he talks about first. Well, first, read the verse. This is Romans chapter 1, verse 1. The verse reads, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. And that's just the first portion of a sentence that really goes for the first 7 verses of that chapter. Paul always has these long sentences that are always a challenge to translate.
That's right.
But in this passage, he says four things. He identifies himself, Paul. He says that he's a servant of Jesus Christ. He says that he's called to be an apostle. He says that he's separated to the work of the gospel. But the last two things he mentions are the things that God does. So look at those first. He says, I'm called to be an apostle. An apostle is a sent one. That literally is what it means. And the model for that is Jesus. Jesus is the sent one. Paul is saying, I'm in that image. It means that what I do isn't out of my own portfolio only. It's not out of my own mindset only. I'm really under orders. But it is more than just a summons. I really take it down to a basic level and talk about salvation as a calling. We kind of dramatize this in the church when we talk about baptism. Baptism is the beginning of your life as a Christian. From the day you're baptized, you are now supposed to carry out life in a different kind of way. This is before you figure out whether you're supposed to teach, preach, whatever. It's different. To be called to be an apostle isn't just that special thing. It's the general thing that says, I've been saved and I'm now going to be a different kind of person. So the first thing God does is he saves us. That's a calling. And then he kind of directs us. And I think Paul gets at that directing part when he uses this verse that says, I've been separated unto the gospel. And we usually read that as set apart for this particular thing. But the really exciting thing here is that this Greek word for separated means, it's the word for horizon. So if you can imagine horizon like a verb instead of a noun, he says God has horizoned me.
Yeah.
And it means that he has set some limits or
Yeah.
some boundaries
Yeah.
within which I can express
Yeah.
the gifts that he's given me. And usually we don't like limits and boundaries. But if the boundary is the horizon, then it means that it's a boundary that's not solid. You know, the horizon is the place where the sky and the sea meet, or the sky and the land meet. And as you move toward the horizon, it moves.
Yes.
So there's not this sense of being constricted, but there is this sense of being focused. And Paul has to focus on something, but even that focus isn't going to limit what he's going to do. So there are two things that God does. He calls us in the sense of salvation, and then he sets us apart. He focuses us on what we're going to do. So let's stop there for a minute and kind of talk about how do you see those things, or how do you respond to this the action of God, that he saves us and that he focuses us.
The focus keeps us connected to the message. And Paul, in looking at himself as a bondservant, looks at him, he's willingly following the Lord, but he's also looking at himself as a slave of the Lord, that he has to keep the focus on the message. And a lot of times if we stay off the focus, we get misled or we can mislead others. And this calling is so high and it's so important for the salvation of men and women that God has placed us on that horizon so that we have a connection. Like we're connected here to White Rock. There is a particular message. There's a particular ministry that we have as we endeavor to share the gospel of Jesus Christ everywhere. But we also have a personal part in this, in that God has separated us, but he didn't separate us to our own selves. He separated us to a mission. He separated us to a local church where we then collectively can carry out our own calling as a part of the calling of all of us as Christians.
I like this idea of vocation, and I like this idea of, it's sort of like, when I think of calling, I think of vocation. And when I think of that, I'm thinking of a predisposition that is created in us toward a certain thing. And so when I look at that, I also look at that at the same time God has carved out, or God orchestrates a space where we can live out that vocation. In the beginning, God created us in the image of God. And so my challenge is to seek God so that I can grow into that image that God has created in me, that vocation, that thing that God has positioned me for.
I like the horizon piece as well, because the interesting thing about horizons is that the further away we are off the ground, the smaller the horizon is, the more difficult it is to see.
All right.
And when I think about my calling, and to answer a call, people have to be grounded in order to answer that call. And I think that when I think about just what did it take to get grounded, it was Christian education. I got grounded in Sunday school. And when you're grounded, you're closer to the horizon, and you can see that call. And I wanted to ask you, how old were you when you taught your first Sunday school class?
I was 18. Part of the story is that mentor, Lee Bain, forced me to do something I didn't want to do when I was getting ready to come out of the senior high department. I was 17, getting ready to graduate high school and leave the senior high department. And I wanted to go on to the college and career department, where Reverend Jim Miles was the instructor. Everybody wanted to go there because that was just
That was the place.
That was
a happening place.
They were dealing with stuff over there. So I'm looking forward to it. And Deacon Bain came to me and said, I want you to think about, not how would you like to be? Now, I want you to think about teaching Sunday school. And I was like, I don't want to be teaching. I still want to be learning. So I went through a year of teacher training and came out and said, well, now what happens? Well, now you get a class. So I'm 18 teaching a class of 15-year-olds in the middle high department. But it was many years later that I discovered that teaching was my gift, not just something that I did as part of the package. That's why, so when I look back on the calling, there were things happening here that I had not focused and had not identified, that many years later are at the forefront. And they're not there because I wove them in. They've been woven in. And it's only on reflecting back that I see it. but I didn't see it then.
The thing about Paul's calling, it's surprising. You would not expect that God would have called Paul.
Yeah. Come on, Doc.
Persecutor of the church.
Yeah, yeah,
And God calls him.
yeah.
And even when God called Moses, Moses tried to get out of it. I'm not able, I don't speak eloquently to do what you're calling me to do. So it's interesting that God sometimes calls persons who most people would view as the most unlikely
That's
person
right.
to be called by God.
That's right.
It's very surprising.
I'm liking this idea of horizon and how, it's not static and so forth. And so perhaps this calling is still evolving.
Yes.
And growing.
Yes.
The comment you made about salvation is a calling. I know that sometimes people in the church assume that it's the preacher that's called and fail to realize that they're called as well. That's why I like the comment you made, salvation is a calling. With that in mind, then it's incumbent upon the church member to realize that they're called as well. There's a plan that God has for you. There's God's will for you. He has some things that he wants you to do.
Right.
And so it's not just the preacher or the deacon, but it's the whole church congregation.
Yeah, but brother preacher, the Bible clearly has said, many are called,
Few are chosen.
but few are chosen. Certainly he did not choose me. So what do we do with that? That sense of many. What does that really mean? Many are called, but few are chosen.
I think this.
Because he certainly didn't mean him.
Horizon is I think it's a helpful word because our thinking about calling is so narrow. When we think about calling, we identify the 2 or 3 things that we think are it, and we know those aren't us, so it can't be anything. But what if calling is this instead of this?
Yeah.
So someone says to you, you have a remarkable way with children under the age of 3. Oh, that's not a calling. Well, then how come everybody can't do it?
Right.
Because that's not my calling.
Right.
You do it so easily. There are so many gifts that are in the body, and they get pigeonholed into places where we know they belong. And then we've got all these other gifts. We don't know what to do with them.
So many are called, and few are chosen into
For
that
this.
particular
That's
gift.
right. Few
I like
people are
that.
chosen for this. It's a wide open piece, and perhaps we need to develop some language for talking with people in general about what it means to respond to God's call.
The concept of evolution. The beautiful thing about DNA is that it evolves. The genetic code, I'll put it that way, that's safer. the genetic code, is determined what something's going to be like.
Right.
But there are aspects that are not determined. This is good preaching stuff. And so there are indeterminate aspects of that.
Wow.
And so as we look at humanity, and as we have evolved into, different shapes, sizes, hues, and so forth, that's because of different places that we're put in. So perhaps, now, because I'm in a place where we got 103-year-olds, and I'm the only one here, and somebody says, "Well, you sure not called?" I was like, "Well, they're here." And so for now, and then God grants us the gifts that we need at that time and place. And then as that evolves, they grow up to be 16-year-olds. Well, Lord, I'm not called to do 16-year-olds. I'm called to do 3-year-olds. Well, you're here and they're here. And God grants us by that grace so that we are able to, use those gifts that God has given us. And so there's something in it that just really allows, it frees up God to do what God wants to do in us. And it doesn't set God in this box and say, I can only do this forever, and that's me, and that's God.
There's so many of us at different times who just don't feel called, or more related to what you were saying, they come into a church, or they come into a Sunday school class. There is a need to be filled, and somebody sees something in you or you and says, I want you to do that, and a person can say, that is not my calling. The 3-year-olds, not my calling. And then the other person in their life that really, there's some need there, is in an uncomfortable position sometimes. Now, sometimes it's not your calling. But sometimes it is, and that's why I really love that, because sometimes I've seen people accept the invitation and with fear and trembling do something that in their mind is not their calling. And God does a work in them, and maybe it really wasn't their calling at the time, but then God does a work in them that it becomes their calling, and I love that. Well, one thing that, I like to put a challenge out to the viewing audience. As Baptists, we definitely believe in the ministry of all believers, and people that are going to watch this are watching on Facebook. And there's this little button on Facebook where you can record yourself if you have the webcam on your computer. So I like to invite people to take maybe a minute and record your calling. You know, just push that button and record, and especially if you're from White Rock, I'm definitely going to put it out there. Just push that little button and maybe take 30 seconds to record your calling, and just leave it on your Facebook page.
And in the broadest sense, calling in the moment, calling for the month, calling for this season,
For the day.
for the day.
Right. Yeah.
It's in large words and in small thoughts.
And
when I woke up this morning, God was urging me to this, and whether that becomes a thing that fills the rest of your life or just fills that day, it's still this sense of responding to the way that God is leading.
Right.
Yeah. And we're going to look for those.
Yeah, we are going to look for those. So do them on the Facebook page. There's probably a way you can include them into the YouTube as well. Maybe say a word about that in a minute. Well, I really want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. We've had a wonderful discussion about the calling and the effect that it has on our lives, and we've used Paul as our example. Thank you for your attention. We invite you to leave answers to these questions. We want you to take time to look at your testimony, look at your personal history, and point to those moments and people that have been significant, and ask, what has God been saying to you in those things? And how do you feel the Spirit of God calls you on a daily basis, on a life basis? And give us those responses. If you want to send email, do that. If you want to go to the YouTube channel or to the White Rock Facebook page and respond to those things so that we can hear something about your calling.
Yes.
We're also interested in any comments that you have in general on these meditations. If there's something you'd like us to talk about, if there's another space in the church that you'd like to see, get that information to us as well. Look also for additional videos in the future on YouTube. Joy to all of you.
Joy.
Sure.